You are listening to Radio Belvaspata, South Africa. This show is dedicated to those who live and love from the heart in infinite ways. In today's episode, we will discuss, share, gain insights, and get clarity on the wisdom and teachings of the mystic and seer Almine, as well as discover more about the miraculous healing modality called Belvaspata. Your host for this show is Paul.
Welcome to Radio Belvaspata, South Africa. This is our episode for May the 11th, 2017. For all of us, it is Thursday evening, 8 p.m. South African Standard Time. Thank you for joining us. Today we're going to talk all things Almine. We're going to be discussing so many different processes. The theme of the show today is called The Inner Family and the Little Match Girl. The seer Almine says to us that in humility, let us acknowledge the perfection of life unfolding. Consciously shape the future with empowered choices today. We're also going to be talking about the courage to be vulnerable. And I've been seeing for myself lately that there's been so many processes going on within myself that I've needed to really just allow to be. It's as if I feel that the world is no longer safe for me to be in, and I've been tending to retreat quite a bit away, and spending some time in bed resting, just relaxing, just being away from things. And I began to understand through this process that I'm feeling vulnerable on certain levels, and that surprised me because one of the aspects of mastery is to work with some of these subpersonalities like the warrior syndrome and just, not be vulnerable. But then I had to really begin to acknowledge these aspects of myself that were there and were processing through, and that it was okay to be vulnerable. So we'll be discussing a lot of this today, and of course the part of the inner family that we're going to be working with tonight is aspects of the inner child. And to share the studio with me today is the beautiful Master Diane.
Good evening, everybody, to everyone out there. We are broadcasting from quite a nippy South Africa. It's already dark, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Paul.
Nice to have you with us tonight. Diane, after all our long public holidays here in South Africa, we finally got a long run at doing things again, haven't we?
Yes, I've got to get back into this.
So last week's show, we really highlighted the aspects of the journey of the subpersonality of the inner warrior. Mm-hmm. And that has had a lot of comment and a lot of input from everyone around. We've really been focusing a lot of that. So I'm interested on this aspect of the little girl that you're going to bring up today and to work with it. And also these feelings of vulnerability that I've been experiencing. Mm-hmm. And then when I talk with everyone, they also bring in aspects of it that might not be saying, it is something I've identified as being vulnerable, but their wording and their thinking and their processing seems to be incredibly vulnerable.
Paul, I'm just wondering if the sort of era of change does bring that kind of vulnerability in, because you don't seem to be standing firmly with 2 feet on the ground. It's almost as if one foot is up and the other is reaching for the other side of the cliff, and it's that almost being groundless that perhaps introduces the kind of vulnerability that you're speaking of. That's
what I've been trying to really explain, I think, on the show over the last few weeks, is that we are living in 2 different worlds. We're living in something that was, and we're learning to let it go, and happy to let it go, but it's still maybe lingering in certain levels. Yes. But then all this new potential and new opportunities are arising, and we are putting that foot across that cliff. But we're like literally, spread eagled, as it were, between 2
across the abyss.
Absolutely. And I mean, our comfort zones are greatly, can I use the word, disturbed?
Yes.
And that's had me incredibly vulnerable. But it's not that I haven't been enjoying the vulnerability. I've been seeing it in its perfection, but it is still there. I've had to honor the fact that, yes, I am vulnerable at times to whatever processes are going on.
I think therein lies a great gift, because in the past, I'm thinking of myself as well, the idea of being vulnerable would suggest a weakness that you want to hide, not only from the world, but also from yourself. And that's not seeing life the way it is. It's seeing life the way you would hope it would be.
Absolutely. And that's according to your beliefs and programmings,
Yes,
and
yes.
wanting to stay in your comfort zone or your little bed, or et cetera, et cetera.
Well, you know, when I was looking at this little matchstick girl, this fairy tale, that kind of living in your fantasy world is in fact what brings you coldness and death. And by death I mean a lack of productivity. For her, the vulnerability was there, but the only way to survive it, you know, from her perspective, was to live in the fantasy world. And that just led her to a dusty death.
Wow. So I'm looking forward to discussing this further.
It's fascinating.
Well, let's get into that in a few minutes. We've got a clip here by the mystic and seer Almine, called "That Life Is Not an Accident." So let's listen to that, and then we'll get into the little matchstick girl and the
Wonderful.
stories around that. I'm
Wonderful.
looking forward
Let's
to
do
it.
that.
Great.
There is a letter from Carl about his desire to be raptured and the great yearning that is in his heart to transcend life and to be raptured. And I don't think that his letter is one that he meant me to read publicly, so I will just summarize it like that. But Carl, I could feel the great desire you have to leave the madness of the world behind and the suffering. There are a few thoughts, my beloved one. Humanity has had some of the hardest lives of all beings. Now, it's true, some races are enslaved, some are endangered. They all have their problems, but the actual feeling of physical suffering is the most acute in the densest matter. And humanity is the densest matter because we are the pivot point of creation. So my point being that suffering has been with humanity for eons. As a result, humanity has always sought to escape it. In the future, they are planning on colonizing Mars. That will lead to a disaster. They also escaped in religion at times to such a fanatical degree that it started to become hostile to those who were not part of their religion. Hence, there have been many genocides. It also ended badly. Escaping ends badly. The reason being that life offers no and allows no shelters. So there is that to consider. Secondly, there is a very, very strong law to remember, and that is that we strengthen what we oppose. If there is a bad habit that you have, if there is what you describe as an undesirable quality in you, fighting it is not the answer. Certainly have self-discipline in how you express it, but acknowledge it and then fill it with something positive in its stead. Replace it. Don't focus on it, focus on what you're putting in its place. That's how we sidestep, that we strengthen what we oppose. Now, Carl, if somebody wants to leave life, life is not an accident. It is a very precious gift that has been given by the Creator to experience itself. It is the gift of individuation. So, to despise the gift and to want to move beyond it in some way will only strengthen it. Meaning that if you oppose life and you wish to escape it, you will strengthen your life and indeed prolong it to a certain extent. Life will become very strong for you. So opposing it and wanting to not live it is not the answer either. So what is the answer? And I'm not saying how to have the rapture. I'm saying the answer to living life as a precious gift, gladly and with contentment every day. If you consider that which we focus on increases. So I challenge you to find one thing each day that you can be grateful for, that you enjoy, that you can be happy about. Just one thing. And it will increase. Eventually there will be 2 things. Then there will be 3 things. This day today, I got to hold a little 1-year-old baby. And I remember the softness of his skin and how he snuggled because he was sleepy. I remember his smell. It stays with me like a very happy song. I remember the sight of my daughter's beautiful long hair in the sunlight and how it was breathtakingly beautiful. It's a sight I carry with me and remember as a precious moment. Everywhere you turn, if you look for one good thing and then another, your life will change, Carl. And it is when we no longer wish to escape the gift of life that we will find what we're looking for. And don't be surprised if it isn't what you think you are looking for.
And you're back in studio with Paul and Diane as we discuss these beautiful teachings of the mystic and Seer Almine about life is not an accident. We're discussing about seeing things in perfection. Diane, I think one of the most interesting things whilst I've been going through all of these experiences, I've also been able to see the poetic perspective of beauty in things. And I still think there's a choice. We can decide which way we're going to go, but there's decidedly been this choice of seeing things in a more poetic, beautiful way and living in the beauty of all of that. Have you had that experience too?
I have, and I understand the poetic perspective is almost, is it something like an eagle vision where you're seeing beyond the immediate and the apparent situation. And therein lies a great awareness, I think, to see the beauty that lies beyond what is apparent to the naked eye.
I think it's important to understand, as a light seeker in the world, the teachings of living in light and love is a paradigm that belonged to another time frame. And if we have not moved into being able to see and live in what light and love has produced, which is an alchemical equation which has produced and created something else, and I think it has created this poetic perspective. And I see so many, I don't know what title, I really, excuse me for saying it, but the light workers of the world or the healers of the world may just be stuck in the simplicity of living in love and light, thinking that's all there is for them, but not being able to merge them together is not creating that next step or that process. And I'm feeling for myself that this aspect of living in the vulnerability is a process of dissolving the old, because I'm now acknowledging things like the inner child's need to have more fun and to rest and to do whatever needs to be done.
And to be proactive and to... And I think something that has amazed me, re the poetic expression or poetic perspective, is that it's not one-dimensional. And that's why I love this inner family, because you're not just looking at the inner child. You're looking at a variety of sort of perspectives of the emotional psyche.
The emotional psyche, I think that's a very powerful statement that's being made right there, and there's a lot of depth to go with it. Because, I mean, you do have different realms around the emotions, like the warrior would produce one experience on an emotional level, whereas the inner child might produce something completely different. And if we try and alienate those, then we're going to start identifying with only one way of being or thinking or feeling.
And I think that kind of obsession leads to dysfunctionality, it leads to distortions, and that's why the integration of duality, of polarity, really therein lies a new perspective and a transcendence.
You know, Almine did an interview once about the destiny of mankind, and the simplicity of it has always stayed with me. And I just want to find those words, because I printed it out for us tonight when I was looking at what we were going to talk. And it just, you know, if we're not careful, we do get stuck in only working on the warrior, because that's who we think we are. We create an identity around all of that. So, of course, I'm shuffling through all of this.
But, Paul, while you're shuffling, that's the thing, is the moment we attach an identity, I believe, to anything, that becomes an entanglement. Not just something which we observe, we become entangled in it. And that's difficult to disassociate.
And then that becomes who you are in all your aspects and processes and in your being. Almine says that man is the densest of all beings, the microcosm of the macrocosm. As such, he is the pivot point of cosmic chance, balancing the inner sub-personalities. He sets in motion a ripple effect that closes down the illusion of time and space. And then just this little thing about, dead air time as we're going along the way here. But I was so taken with it, where Almine was literally saying, okay, we will find it just now, but literally Almine was asked the question, well, is it good to balance the sub-personalities? And she says, but that's part of the journey, but the ultimate, the ultimate destiny is to dissolve them so that they no longer exist. And that's a reminder today, you know, of allowing whatever is there, but know that it's just passing through.
Absolutely, not attaching any particular value or elevating it. It's just something that you experience and move through, but don't become entangled
and
by it.
And it's real at this moment for you, so allow the realness of it, but it doesn't have to become your truth. It's just a part of the journey.
It doesn't have to become you. It's something that you have accumulated, and it's something that you can then put down. So although we're going to talk about it tonight,
it's just part of the process, isn't it? Yes. And the reality is what we create of it, but let it just come and go.
Let us take the poetic perspective from it, and don't try and remember it and try and learn from it. Simply accept it in this moment and let it disappear back into the ether.
Well, I think what Almine has been discussing this week really on Almine Diary and on Lightworker, aspects about the reptilian brain, and I feel I've had a huge connection through all of that with my own health issue during this particular week. And as this has cleared away, I've been aware of the vulnerability and the trauma that sits underneath everything, and how that has brought a lot of trauma up surfacing and having to be worked on. I mean, you don't have to be, oh God, I'm working on something. Yes, we all are, no matter what we are doing, you know, whatever process we're all working with in the world. But I've actually begun to understand the depth of that identity searching and the ego identity that is desperate to hold on to its sickness or its trauma or its processes.
Do you think that's part of this reptilian experience, is the ego, which is almost in its death throes?
I definitely do, because just in short, I mean, not to go into the depth of it, but I went to sleep the other night with a massive migraine, and during the night I started dreaming that there was this overlaying of identity through the reptilian realm, if I could say that way, and it was trying to force down that which was ready to let go of everything. So it was like holding on to that particular identity. When it had me knocked out for a few days, I must say the experience was like so huge with it. But that's what I took from it.
Yes.
And then when Almine was coming up with teachings about the reptilians and this and that, and I know the question has been today, has the reptilian aliens finally gone now that we've gone through the Earth Day meditation and everything with Almine?
Yes, I didn't get a chance to read the entire thing, but it will be interesting to follow it to its conclusion.
Absolutely. I mean, everything has its role. Everything is in perfection. So we can't say it's right or wrong if we are going to follow what we are talking about now. But everything has its role. We need to really look at that insight and work with it.
And that little clip that you read now about the microcosm and the macrocosm, always we have to look at that.
Yeah, absolutely. What is within is without. And
absolutely.
As we dissolve that, then they will have to merge and work with it.
And if you take a step forward, we all take a step forward.
That's it. Yeah. And it's collective, isn't it?
Yes,
it is exponentially collective.
Yes, and Paul, you know what I was thinking just now when you were talking is it is so important for it to be part of our living experience. It's all very well to talk about, you know, what is happening and who's experiencing what, but unless it is real for you,
you're never going to understand it.
It is valueless.
Or be able to work with it.
Well, perhaps not valueless, but it's not quite the same unless you know it and you've lived it.
I know what you're saying by valueless, because unless you've had that experience, it is not yours. Nobody else can teach it. You can have compassion and understanding of it.
Absolutely.
But unless it's yours, you've got nothing to say. You've got nothing to add to it.
Yeah. Because the insight is not there, the perspective is not there.
Yeah. I was with somebody the other day who got really, really ill, and they've just passed away. And I was speaking to them before it happened, and they were telling me about all of this. And I said to them, I'm sorry, I really have nothing to add or say. I just really hold you in my heart, and I really just know that this is what we have at this moment. And if you need to talk, let's talk. And they turned around and said they're so grateful what I said, because everybody comes and they're trying to fix them and sort everything out. And I stood there and I went, oh, okay, well, lesson for me as well.
Yeah. But that's also a learned response, that if someone is in pain or someone is desperately ill, because we are so uncomfortable, we try to bring in, you know, reasons why they should do A, B, and C, and what they should believe and how they can make this better, and simply just to sit with them and communicate just by listening. What a wonderful lesson for us all.
So there we go. That was my experience, and often up on my Facebook page I write the lesson of the week. I'm still pondering on that one. The week is not quite over
finished.
As yet. So we're going to talk about the little matchstick girl now and work through some of these beautiful experiences. What are we doing?
Well, Paul, I'm just going to urge yourself to sort of sit back and sip on your hot tea here.
Oh, thank you.
And our listeners as well. I'm going to be chatting for about 15, 20 minutes. And just sit back and maybe keep yourself warm with a lovely soft blanket and just go back into the realms of those times when your parents would sit with you and perhaps read to you a little fairy tale. I've done quite a bit of work on the sub-personalities, and I wondered what our conventional fairy tales could reveal with regards to this inner family. And let's just recap. Our inner family, we've talked about the inner child, the inner nurturer, the inner sage, and the inner warrior, and all the qualities that they really embody. And we talked about a sub-personality, and we talked about it being related to the emotional part of the psyche. So let's keep that in mind. I'm going to quickly just recap the little story of the matchstick girl, and then we can have a look at it. Sit back, everybody, and relax. There was a little girl child who had neither a mother nor a father, and she lived in a dark forest. There was a village at the end of the forest, and she learned that she could buy matches there, and for a halfpenny she could sell them on the street for a full penny. And if she sold enough matches, she could buy a crust of bread. She could return then to her little lean-to in the forest and sleep there, dressed in all the clothes that she owned. Well, the winter came and it was cold. She had no shoes. Her coat was very thin and she was extremely cold and to the point of being blue. She wandered the streets of the village and she begged strangers would they please buy matches from her. But no one stopped and no one paid her any attention. So she sat down one evening and she decided, I have matches, I'm going to light a little fire with them, even though I don't have firewood. So she sat there with her legs stretched out in front of her, and she struck her first match. And as she did that, the cold and the snow disappeared altogether. And what she saw instead of swirling snow was a room, a beautiful room, with a green, dark ceramic stove. And from the stove emanated so much heat that it made the air wavy. And she snuggled up close to the stove, and it felt heavenly. But all of a sudden the stove went out, and she was again sitting in the snow, shivering so bitterly. And so she struck the second match, and the light fell upon the wall of the building next to where she sat, and she could suddenly see through it. And there, in the room behind the wall, was a snowy cloth covering a table, with beautiful china and a platter with a goose that had just been cooked. And just as she was about to reach for this vision, it disappeared. And once again she was in the snow. But now her knees and her hips no longer hurt. And the cold was stinging and burning its way up her arms and her torso. And so she finally lit the third match. And in the light of the third match was a magnificent Christmas tree, beautifully decorated, glass ornaments, and thousands of little dots of light that she couldn't really make out. And as she looked up at this enormous tree that went higher and higher and stretched farther and farther towards the ceiling until it became the stars in the heavens over her head, and a star blazed across the sky, and she was immediately transported to when her mother had told her that when a soul dies, a star falls. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, her grandmother appeared, so warm and so kind. And she felt so delightedly happy to see her. And the grandmother picked her up, put her apron around her, held her close with both arms, and the child was content. But the grandmother began to fade, and the child struck more and more matches to keep her grandmother with her, and more matches to keep her grandmother with her, and more. And they began to rise together into the sky, and there was no cold, and there was no hunger, and there was no pain. And in the morning, between the houses, the child was found, still and gone. I'm sure you remember that fairy tale.
Oh.
I don't know if you do, Paul.
I
do you remember
actually.
it?
It's bringing back great memories at the moment. I'm really enjoying it.
Well, I always felt a kind of sentimental satisfaction that this little abandoned girl, who in some stories is called Isabella, that she had found solace in the arms of her dead grandmother. Mm-hmm. However, after reading a book, and I'm going to give you the title because I think our readers will love it. It's called Women Who Run with the Wolves, and it's by Clarissa Pinkola Estes. And combining that with Almine's perspectives of the inner personalities, I began to think differently, and I began to look behind the appearance. So the first little thing that I looked at was this child, this abandoned inner child, who should have been supported. The inner nurturer in this case would have been perhaps in the form of a mother or a father. They abandoned their charge, and they forced her out into the cold to sell matches just for a pittance. Now, the functional inner child would naturally have been proactive, living a joyful, optimistic life. However, that dysfunctional inner child was afraid of being alone, unable, therefore, to leave the cold, unsupportive environment. And without warmth and support, the little matchstick girl literally and figuratively began to freeze, and inertia began to set in. And then I began to look at the dysfunctional, absent nurturer and how that influenced this child negatively. And how the child, unused to ever hearing anything warm, any words that were supportive, stays in the cold. She does not move into the sun. So, from her perspective, there appeared to be no choices. She could have looked for shelter from the storm. She could have gone to another village where people may have welcomed her, may have nurtured her. But we know, and I know, that when our inner child and my inner child is abandoned, that often a kind of numbness sets in, and we simply are unable to follow the paths of self-preservation and self-sovereignty. And all this happens when our inner child is abandoned and our inner nurturer is absent or dysfunctional. So the healthy inner nurturer, who normally operates within that field of white magic, is a powerful force, whilst the dysfunctional inner nurturer contributes, in fact, to the destruction of the soul. What then just floods out are feelings of unworthiness, and instead of the environment becoming a fountain of knowledge, what happens? It becomes frozen. It becomes infertile. For the little girl, no stranger stopped. No one would buy her matches. They ignored her. So this dysfunctional inner child, literally on a metaphorical and a literal level, was left alone and terrified. So when people are left out in the cold, when we allow ourselves to live in the cold, we tend to live out our fantasies in the same way as that little matchstick girl did. Her fantasies have no basis in reality, and eventually they anesthetize her. And I began to ask myself, how often do I become anesthetized? And by what? Some people use alcohol, drugs. Often people throw themselves into their work. In this little clip that we just heard of, Almine speaking, she talked about how often religion does that. And what those elements do is just momentarily push this pervading feeling of possible hopelessness and isolation aside. And they allow the fantasy to take over. So this fantasy world seemed to call to our little matchstick girl, and it became so real that she was seduced by it. So what does she do? She sells off all her matches, which are her only source of warmth, and she trades them for her fantasies.
Sure.
And this is where I felt our inner warrior should have played a part. You spoke about your inner warrior and vulnerability, Paul. Now, the inner warrior's function is to stave off and stalk illusion. But for the little matchstick girl, and so often for us, that inner warrior allowed those illusions to manifest. So what the little girl does is she takes match number 1. She lights it and she feels the warmth of the stove, but only for a moment. That warmth of wanting a home within her seems to bloom and blossom, but soon the picture dissolves. Then she takes match number 2, and she receives in that fantasy the illusion of food for the body, food for her soul. But once again, damn, just for an instant. Then she takes match number 3, and this allows her just a momentary glimpse of Christmas, a magnificent time to celebrate and rejoice in. And what I realized was that all of these glimpses are of what could have been, what may have been. None of them show her what is.
What actually is happening.
What actually is happening.
The reality, yeah.
The reality of her world. So the inner warrior gives up the battle for self-knowledge in favor of these illusions. Now, these fantasies are so seductive. They are lethal distractions from reality and what really is. And then we introduce this inner sage, Now, the wise elder may be representative, perhaps, of the grandmother. The grandmother should have urged this child to do something different. But what does the grandmother do? She just enfolds her in her apron, once again brings momentary comfort. And what does that do? That lights that child's way to dusty death. So a functional inner sage is able to envision the future, follow a higher version of reality. The inner sage, the functional inner sage, would see beyond the appearance. But a dysfunctional sage does none of these things. This grandmother, she comforts, but she does not nurture. And there is such a huge distance between that.
Yeah, not actually removing the journey from the child.
No, allowing her,
supporting them,
supporting her in that vision of lack. Now, I was thinking that the inner sage, perhaps we could substitute it with the word inner guru. And if we look at the meaning of guru, the first part, the GU, stands for darkness. And the RU, the Ru, actually means dispels. So the guru, inner guru, outer guru, is a dispeller of darkness. By its very nature, which is filled with light, it should dispel the darkness. That's what the grandmother should have done. But she didn't. She supported the child's limitations. She offered solace, comfort, but no nurturing.
That supports the grandmother's belief system anyway.
Absolutely. And initially I thought, oh, how wonderful that the grandmother would enfold the child and drift up into oblivion where there was no pain, there was no suffering. But when I looked just a little further, I realized that too is an illusion.
Wow.
So it would seem that in this story, and possibly in our own lives as well, all the members of the inner family were dysfunctional. And what is the result? The result is that their child is found still and gone. So, if the inner family had been working together, they would have been able to heal. In fact, a healthy inner family would have precluded any addiction to fantasy by pushing, prodding, protecting. Action would have been initiated by the nurturing. I mean, I try to explain or get a picture in my head between the difference between what is comforting and what is nurturing. And I thought, well, if I put a pot plant in my cupboard and every day I open the door, give it a bit of water, close the door, that would be comforting. But if I took that plant out and I put it in the bright, harsh sunlight, that would have been nurturing. And that is what that inner family should have done. So instead of remaining in this dark cave of the mind and of fantasy, I just think that we have the choice of balancing our inner family, feeding ourselves and allowing ourselves not to be found still and gone. And Paul, I don't know, I just think we've been working and talking about this, and all our listeners out there, we are hoping in the next month or so to put a course together, looking at the sub-personalities on this vertical axis, looking at their qualities, the field of existence that they inhabit, the body, the organs that are affected by the influences. And I think it would be a phenomenal way for our listeners just to find greater depth.
And get some depth and insight into their own processes.
Yes. And you talked about a poetic perspective. This is an astounding method to see beyond the appearance, to learn from nurturing ourselves rather than comforting ourselves. So yes, we hope that you will join us, everyone.
It'll be fantastic. I'm really looking forward to developing all of that. I feel a lot of it could be like working with Almine's teachings on recapitulation as well, going into the depth of those processes and then letting it dissolve and understanding it on a much deeper level.
That recapitulation process is valid, is always valid. It's part of an old body of work, but it keeps resurfacing because it's a tool that it just strips away illusion.
Absolutely, yeah. As it comes up, and we can go deeper and deeper into those particular processes.
No, that is an astounding tool.
I love the story. Thank you, Diane. I think we should have a story time with the team.
That would be wonderful. I hope you enjoyed it.
Enthusiastic and passionate. I loved it. I was just like sitting here thinking again, with my family as I was growing up, we listened to radio theatre.
I remember that.
The actors were so brilliant, you could really get involved. And that was also nurturing on some level and working through all of that. But again, an old time, and an old way of working with it. Okay, so everyone, we now have a beautiful short audio on the teachings and the wisdom that Jason Silva, the TV personality, shows. And it really links us how primal trauma resurfaces in our lives. And this is just his explanation of his journey. And he really concludes with it, well, he still doesn't know.
Sure.
And I like that because it doesn't have to be an outcome. There just has to be a sense of, I'm ready to discover. So let's listen to that.
Wonderful.
So I've been thinking that I believe human beings all harbor a kind of primal trauma. I think the moment of birth is the first, the initiation, the agony of separation. It's the first time in which we experience fragmentation, from being in a kind of cosmic merger with a divine being, with a goddess, with our mother, to all of a sudden trembling naked before the cosmos. And I think that primal trauma, I think that initial separation leaves us all with a intermittent PTSD. I think that we carry the scars from birth, and that these fears, these traumas, resurface at pivotal periods of our lives. I think a lot of the patterns in our romantic life in particular reflect this primal trauma, reflect this fear of abandonment. I know in my own romantic life, I tend to idealize romantic partners. I tend to turn them into goddesses in order that they can serve as conduits for that divine merger, for that return to the womb with a view, so to speak, for that primal trauma. And so what's really interesting is that we spend our lives perpetually reenacting these traumatic experiences without ever realizing where they stem from in order to address them and potentially heal them. It's why we make such a failure of our romantic undertakings, and why most people lead lives of quiet desperation. I think the fear of loneliness, I think the cosmic fear of abandonment is polluting our romantic lives in ways that we don't often address. And so the question becomes then, is there a solution? Is there a kind of journey of transformation, our own version of the eat, pray, love undertaking, where we learn to become whole on our own so that meeting somebody else becomes an additive, a supplement, rather than a filling of a vacuum, so to speak. And it's a journey I haven't quite figured out. Meandering walks on the beach and contemplative introspection is just one way of trying to find an answer to the question that drives us. And I haven't figured it out yet.
Back in studio with myself, Paul, and Diane. We have a very interesting question really been raised by Darshana up on the page on Spreaker.com at the moment. And she's saying is that, can we not compare these to our desires too? Our impulsive minds want us to fulfill our desires now, but a developed intellect or our inner gurus would govern us and make us assess everything first. Yeah, it's a very interesting question, Darshana, and some deep processes there. So I don't really have an immediate answer with that, except to suggest is that maybe our intellect is also made up of past programming and beliefs, and as we let go of that, surely there must be some shifts and changes coming in terms of where we're at. And I think just the question that I've got coming up here, and Diane, maybe there's an answer to it right now. I don't know, but that answer is going to be relevant to where we're at in our own journeys. I mean, when we look at the story of the matchstick girl here, what triggers off her own journey where she can actually take herself into a place where she's ready to absorb more light in her own life and be able to then act as a capacitor for all transformation, because it has to come from a decision or a change somewhere that we make within ourselves in terms of, well, I don't want to say the search because that creates an identity,
Yes.
but there has to be a triggering point in all of our lives where we make a decision that says something has to shift. I mean, is it an intellectual thing? Is it an instinctive thing because of who we really are deep down? We're not this human paradigm all by itself. You know, we're far deeper than all of that. What do you think for our story today of this beautiful story of the matchstick girl as she lights the matches? What do you think triggers off that she knows she has to light the matches?
Paul, I think possibly it's desperation that drives her to lighting the matches, and the fact that she feels that there are no other choices. And there are times, I think, within our own intellect where there doesn't seem to be any hope. But that is, I think, because we are immersed in our own tragedy, and we don't assume the poetic perspective. We don't look beyond what is happening, and we don't do the recapitulation. What is our contract here? What is our involvement? How have we manifest this? Because ultimately we create who we are at this moment. We have to take full responsibility of that.
Well, I think the prediction for the week explains this.
Let's hear.
And what I love about our show is how it organically expands into the discussion, and it's all there for us to look at. So, the prediction for this week of May 18 up to the 14th is, behind the veil of illusion, the true essence of the one is always evident. In every object, event, and person, see perfection. Seeing perfection in everything allows you to experience awe and inspiration on this magnificent journey. And then just further on down, express curiosity to follow the never-ending mystery of existence, and you will gain access to hidden insights. Watch for signs in your environment. Allow the activation, or the word is used, literacy, in interpreting cosmic guidance, and express self-confidence in your inner knowing. And that, to me, describes what we're really saying at the moment, how we step onto this path. I mean, I can just look at it in terms of my own journey. That's all I've got to actually understand.
Yes.
Is there was a vulnerability, but I'm okay with it. It's not going to hold me back, but it is something that has to be accessed now because there's a new understanding developing, et cetera, et cetera. And something for me is saying now is that my own matchstick has now been lit to show me a different way.
Well, Paul, I think we could use those resources in various ways. For Isabella, the little matchstick girl, she used them as a means to become seduced by her fantasies. You may use them to light the darkness. That own inner guru would dispel the darkness. And we're not putting, a label on light and darkness. We're just saying, this is what I feel at the moment. So you might use your matches differently. Those we all have a source of warmth.
Our own box of matches, literally,
Yes.
which we've created.
That is our own source of warmth. That is what gives us motivation, which dispels inertia, which provides us with a different perspective. Because if we're stumbling around in the dark cave of the mind, the dark cave of the intellect, and I'm not saying the intellect and mind, cannot be used to magnificent effect, but if it's just about the mind and just about the intellect, we will stay in that dark cave of the mind and never perceive the true essence of who we really are, because we're so attached to this identity.
I really think so. Darshana's bringing up other questions as well online on our screen, talking about aspects of desires and that kind of thing. So I think I'd love to have a conversation with her about this, maybe in a
maybe,
future show.
yes.
About where, these desires actually do come from, because there has to be need and desire in all of the process through an understanding of that. And is vulnerability also not part of that need, needing something or allowing ourselves to then actually experience what that is. So we're getting into a deep conversation.
We are, and I'd like to chat with Dashana about that, so maybe we can in the week and then reintroduce it into the show next week. And all our listeners, if these are the kind of things that, plague you or just pique your interest, send it to us. This is the kind of thing that will feed our soul.
Well, it is family time after all, is it not?
It
Talking
is.
about inner families.
It is.
So we're here to nurture and to look after,
Yes.
and also to see different realities.
Yes, and to probe those curiosities that appear within the inner child.
Well, we have another short audio clip by the Seer Almine, and here she's talking about a slave race that cannot think straight. It's a little bit of an old clip, but I see it's just re-emerged into the discussion amongst everybody. And she's really talking about the slave species of how we are trapped and all of that, which goes with our conversation tonight.
Because what does trap us are our old belief systems.
The old ways of doing
Yes.
things, Yeah, fascinating. So let's listen to that.
So what we have is the following. My brothers and sisters, as you might have deduced, yes, man is vastly, mentally behind the other star races, because they have not been in a situation of being wiped out 6 times to arrive at this 7th wave of humanity, and with them was wiped out any progress they made with science, for example, or wisdom, things about consciousness and awareness and those sorts of things. Now, 2 of the other things that I'm often asked is, A, you have said that a lot of star races disguise themselves by a sort of a mind suggestion that we see them as human when they're not. They tell us how we should see them. So how are any of them in my classes? Well, I have definitely had them come to my large public addresses. In other words, if I address usually before a workshop, we may do a free night where everybody can come and bring their friends. They've been in those groups, but they think that I am completely wrong on many things and don't know what I'm talking about, etc. So they don't actually come to the workshops. They just come to check out if I have what they think is of value, and because they are with awareness and consciousness, etc., and the mystical laws of the cosmos. They are like we are with their science, children. And no, they don't understand it. And also the other problem is that they think they know. Man's history is completely misunderstood by them, because they can't look back further enough to see at the very onset of the first wave of humanity how the creation happened. They just see in genetic engineering by races, the Anunnaki, the Nordics, and then there have been some, let's say, contribution by the Pleiades in these experiments. And that's all they see. So they see a slave race created that can't think straight and act like juveniles. And they're not even very compassionate. I mean, they regard us as something in a zoo.
And there we were listening to the mystic and seer Almine as she explained about the processes of really linked to the reptilian energy, which she's been teaching about this last week or 10 days, about how they see humanity. quite interesting concept of all of that. If we think we have a specific identity in the cosmos,
Yes.
we need to realign that understanding.
Yeah, Paula, I tend to look at it metaphorically, and that's my perspective. I'm trying to stay with what I know and what is living within me,
Right.
so I can learn and listen from Almine, and she has this incredible ability of always, really putting these difficult
The details,
yes,
yeah.
and sometimes I battle a little bit with that, but I've always found that along the way there's always something to explain it. So I'm going to wait for the moment and see what develops.
I think that's one of the things we have developed is the ability to be patient and know that it's part of something that's unfolding, and we don't have to know everything immediately.
Yes.
And as we are ready for it, then it will manifest for us.
Yeah, and I think that's a life skill that I've learned, because if I think back of how I would rush in where angels fear to tread and make up my mind and decide this was wrong and that was right.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that's one of the skills that I won't say I've mastered it yet, but I've definitely managed to wield it with greater skill.
There's more compassion, I think, for the self as well, in terms of allowing yourself to have those experiences and just let it unfold.
And it's okay, and I think it's sincere and it's honest to say I don't really understand this yet. For me, it hasn't become real yet, and it may be a lack of perspective, a lack of clarity, but I'm going to sit with it. And we were talking, I'm not sure if it was on the show now or pre-show, where you wanted to comfort someone who was in dire straits. It was on the show, yes. And just sitting with it sometimes is the way to be.
Yeah, you can just be who you are at that particular moment. But I think we've got to watch for those triggers of trying to fix and heal and sort everything out, because that's our journey, not anybody else's. And is it the role that we've taken on? This is a question, that needs to really be discovered. But as you say, let's put together this workshop and let's put together something on an online level, and then we'll go and discover it more and invite people around the world who are listening to us just to join in on that special family day and that moment of being together.
I really look forward to that, because we'll all learn together and discover together.
Absolutely incredible. I think that's the beauty of where we are at this time, indeed. And I, for myself, have learned amongst the Light family is just to watch the perfection of who they are unfolding. And everybody is so incredibly unique in all of that.
Paula, wonderful that you can see that, because there's just no expectation there. And that kind of perspective just allows all boundaries and limits to just slip away. It's like coming out of your tent, pulling open the flap, and there are the Himalayas.
Well, perhaps part of Almine's teachings which are coming up, we were talking about the webinars about living in boundlessness. That is the new journey of allowing all of this high magic just to manifest in our lives. And
so much space to move.
Be incredible. Yeah. Isn't it ironic? I agree with that, because isn't it ironic, as space dissolves, we're creating more space for ourselves to allow ourselves to be more in.
And I find there's a strange kind of paradox there, because all of a sudden, space is disappearing or dissolving, and you find yourself in absolute spacelessness. That's astounding.
Yeah, very much so.
And I'm just thinking, here you are in your tent, which is defined and small, and all it needs is that flap which opens, and there lies everything in boundlessness.
Absolutely incredible.
It's just that flip of the flap, and all of a sudden your landscape has changed.
It's changed, and your vision has changed, and the world is out there for you to go and discover.
And maybe that's what our matches are for. Just to light it, to enable us to take action, not to stay in the dark dampness of that cave.
Yeah. Absolutely, and the world is bigger than that now for us as well.
Yeah.
As Almine has said, is that those healers of the world and those wise ones and the sages of the world have produced incredible moments living like that, but we are those who live
Yes.
our lives in fullness, and we don't have to hide away in the darkness of a cave.
Yeah. And they've walked that walk, and they have done that so that we don't have to do that.
There you go. Perfect role.
What a gift is
Isn't
that?
that amazing? So
Yeah.
off to India we go and go and discover some of those. The travel bug is biting me.
That
I must
sounds
say.
wonderful.
So that's good. A little bit of boundlessness coming in there.
Let's
and
manifest that, Paul.
I think we should have a special series on the radio. On Radio Belvaspita, where we have story time.
Oh, that sounds.
And it would
that's
be wonderful to have you reading those stories to us.
I'd love to do that.
This
Thank
is
you.
lovely. So let's develop something.
We'll work on that.
To all our listeners, thank you so much for joining us for this edition of Radio Belvaspita South Africa, as we discussed the inner family, and we worked with the story and the fairy tale and the unfolding of the journey around the little matchstick girl brought to us by Diane tonight. We'll develop all of that. We're going to play out now with a beautiful track called Sacred Earth Love by Exquisite Divine Beauty, created by Vanessa Power in Ireland as part of our beautiful Light family. And Diane, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll chat again very soon.
Thanks, Paul. Good night, all.
And good night to all our listeners around the world, South Africa and around the world. This is Radio Belvaspita South Africa. Goodbye.
You've been listening to Radio Belvaspita, South Africa. Thank you for listening and sharing in our discussion. Should you have any questions with regards to the healing modality of Belvaspita or have any healing needs, please send us an email to info@belvaspita.co.za or add comments to our page on Spreaker.com so we can work on providing a suitable response. We now close this episode with the eternal ascension qualities of love, praise, gratitude, and trust, and look forward to sharing again with you next week. Goodbye.